I had a naive thought when watching a video about physics. They were showcasing a transistor and how it has it has three legs and it has an interior. And in the interior, there's a space where there's a charge and there's a barrier and then there's another charge. And adding current to one of the legs will make it such that over a certain amount, those two banks of charge start flowing. And I had this naive thought that it was like two kinds of ants fighting. If they were particles and the ants are particles, then it's like, dogs barking at each other from behind a fence. And then, the dynamics of who gives and who takes is like dependent on how much of a force they're bringing psychologically and intimidation tactics in some sense. So it's almost like chasing birds or like how things behave. It's as if there's from a panpsychist standpoint, a primitive psychology that the atom has in terms of going towards certain things, avoiding others, and not interacting with things, that are neutral in some sense. So yeah, that's very interesting, and as well, it's connected to this thought of the cell as having to be enclosed by various structural particularities in the maintenance of a difference between its inside and the environment, and how then that's like a function running in terms of it being like a Stirling engine. It's always going to have an ability to take in or let out some energy depending on how the differential is structured. And this give and take is, in some sense, the maintenance of a baseline. Yeah, I don't know what all happens in terms of what makes experience possible, but I'm very impressed with science on the whole thing of making artificial life or, well, real life for that matter, using materials of life that then, as protocells or as basic units in some sense, code for a different organism entirely, something that is alive and has a kind of intelligence or a capacity to gain more through having more encoded in its genes. And yeah, all that substantial work then with proteins as well as the difference that genes have. Genes don't only code for proteins, there's so much like an alien language that we don't understand. But that's happening in us. I mean, everyone in some sense evolves in their own lifetime a little bit. And all these differences do add up to how we feel, differences in how we feel, and the reality of that politically as well. So, yeah. But I mean, even emotions, I have this thing that, with non duality, it in some sense implies that instead of saying that the world is false, like some non dualists, like the Nisargadatta type, you can say that the aspects of experience are definitely related to the size of energy, as in the descriptions by physicists of the location and charge of particles and that kind of stuff. That, how sweet tastes is to do with the charge of, how much positive or negative energy there is in a particular molecular structure and the bonds that it has with your molecular structures. And so there's a kind of physics of quality that remains to be experienced. And I think that the environment is something that gains experience, and that experience is like comfortable in a zone of particularity, like how being too close to the fire is uncomfortable and too far away is too cold if the environment is colder than the body. And in that sense, the zone of particularity that enjoys a certain temperature says something about the structural conditions that enable experience, and that experience is something that happens first outside of a body, but in a zone of comfort, and that then, like a slime mold, as if it had to evolve further beyond its sharing different nuclei to become individual celled units like we are in, the mammalian class of animals, then it would be like, individuating a kind of molecular schizoidism that nevertheless works with itself politically and has effects overall that are different from, in some sense, the kind of joint experience as a singularity that is also internally somewhat plural, that slime mold must have, yeah. So yeah, these are some interesting thoughts, perhaps a bit discombobulated, but I think it's fertile with information. Uh, yeah, you know, I have these glasses in my window that have a piece of aluminum foil in it, and there's salt in it, and there's essentially algae growing inside. And what's always weird to me is the way how adding water, if it evaporates, makes the salt travel a lot. Like on top, I don't know if you can see this, but yeah, there's like different crystals and salt structures, and there's algae growing in there, and I live far from the sea. I don't know what the aluminum is doing. I don't know how it works. I just had this idea one day that if I put the equivalent of something with a differential, like a glass of water, and a piece of something sticking between the environment and the water, then it will be kind of like having a I don't know. It's not a battery because it's not connecting to anything in terms of a discrete circuit that has a stop and a start. It's like environmentally already connected with the whole. So it's a kind of circuit. And yeah, clearly that is very favorable for algae to grow in here, but I'm sure they would grow without the aluminum. But I wonder then what the contribution is of the metal and the salt to the things because it's far from the sea. So it's weird. Maybe they are just able to deal with the salt but don't like it, or maybe they are something that came from the sea and blew with the wind very far away and somehow landed in my glass of water in my window. And it's also, if you think about quantum effects, weird in the sense that clearly these things are alive and they're growing and they have generations of new cells happening in here, and that science essentially says that you can anesthetize a Venus flytrap. I imagine that a lot of things with green probably has some aspects of consciousness, and that it's not necessarily to say that everything is conscious. I mean, a panpsychist would imply that everything is conscious, but I think that maybe there is an intensive limit, and that things are at first like mutualized in the environment as the environment for itself, and then structurally things can become for itself within the environment in a way where they are nomadic like we are. We can push off of surfaces and be changed in our position in space-time in a way where a plant has to expend energy and become larger structurally to have some of the equivalent effects or distribute seeds and all that kind of stuff. No, but I was just going to say that, what kind of evolution is happening in this jar, considering it's been like maybe 2 years of having this algae in my window? It clearly lives around me, and so, how does my being there affect it? I mean, these are all real questions, and I think it's as related to everything else as phrenology, because people can say that the bumps of your head have nothing to do with how you feel, but I think that you know everything is connected, and in that sense, from your fingertips to how the bottom of your feet looks to how your head is all part of one system, and one aspect will describe some of the other aspects. And in that sense, if you look at the top of your head or at someone's face, we're comfortable with knowing from faces, but knowing with hands about the bone is supposedly something different. So I would make a case that phrenology was never dead, and that people in some sense became correlationist, and that it was ugly for a long time, and that phrenology will make a return in the same way how that company, what is it, with the image generation, it was what's their name, uh, Mid Journey. I want to say Mid Journey. Yeah, something like that. They had like the sound thing recently in the news where the ultrasound or something can send waves through your body, and then they can use AI to decode it even better than an MRI. So, in that sense, it's amazing how information propagates, and I think it's very likely that a lot of small life is intimate to this programming language that we live in called being, in a way that we are alienated from as people and larger organisms that live in the between of our minds with each other and the world, more than in this sense that our cells still enjoy. In that sense, I think that like Indian philosophy, the whole body is full of intelligence, and that we are in some sense only alienated from it, and that we can connect to the greater whole of ourselves and of the greater being beyond us. Yeah. So then also the question, like with temperature, there's of course spin information in that, and there's different statefulness aspects of phase in the atomics and molecular structures, even about a rock or your own body, and you can exchange some of this information in temperature by heating things up. And so what I want to know is given that someone else can then pick up a rock and feel how it is warm in a similar way to how your body is warm, just like smelling someone's jacket can remind you of them, and not only because of the specific like scent, but like the metadata that's attached, the way it's attached to specific feelings, how smell brings back memories. I think that where a memory and a molecule being inside of your nose attaching to a receptor, where that relates to a memory, that transition is like a very important thing for coming to understand what quality and consciousness is as aspects of ontology at large in realism. So yeah, what does it mean that the whole world behaves like memory, and that you can essentially, dangle something from a rope and cause it to retain information for a few minutes when it loses its information as it goes back and forth, it's like the whole world is a computer, and we're these very bad programmers who almost don't want to believe that we're programmers. Yeah. This is a long talk, and I'm alienated as well in my method of speaking and coming to making sense because of all the, how can we say, constraints involved with going off the rails or losing my train of thought or what you think and all these things. One is so affected by the conditioning from without that one, in some sense, immanentizes the difference as a, just like how people internalize morality and feel guilty and then later meet friends who feel differently, and then life opens up for them in a way, and then it's a whole dialectic of, but my family was this way and this way is how the world is and these are how this people feel, and it sort of makes the whole larger and all the aspects still remain focusable in, like in memories, how it was, and one is both more whole and less whole than yourself, given that moment to moment the connectivity of your brain is different. Like imagine how the Pauli exclusion principle applies if electrons were information and we literally use them to remember things. Imagine how it would be if you were using a certain aspect of your brain holistically and that it had an allostatic load which prevented a holistic access to other information by the way it occupies and excludes the same capacities that would be used in fully experiencing the other information, like saying you can't be wholly angry and wholly something else at the same time without it being another emotion, It's like how colors mix or something. I don't know, but the point would just be that maybe the better example is the visual field, like how it is like economics. Given that you're seeing something in particular, there's a whole set of other things that you aren't seeing, and that locality is in some sense a grander extension of this exclusion principle, which commits us to finitude and particularity as having some of it all of the time and not all of it all of the time, with all of the difference as a particular, how could we say, finite meta-representational realism in which Dasein is no longer in a localist paradigm. Yeah, similar to how we understand things on a semantic level as the thought without picturing that is nevertheless available but without having a discrete relationship to morphology, only to the allostatic load sense of what it takes from us and how much reserve there is to get through it or not be able to get through it. This sense of the economics of being relate to the quality of being and the quality of being in a way that is not sufficiently explored and that needs schema expansion, and which is so pathologized by the likes of what the experience of using Claude is like with 2025, 2026. It's a very hedged away, skeptical, correlationist, leftist experience that truly tries to semantically bracket off and, you know, call things dense, call things what they aren't. I have a story about dense. If you say a piece of writing is dense, then I say you having idea of reference. That's a psychological term. It's like when a schizophrenic thinks someone is talking about them that isn't talking about them in a paranoid way. It's like when the TV is referencing you, but it's not really about you. Why can I say that? Because it requires someone else being more stupid and the example of them being the representative example, as in they are the majority, the ones in charge, so to say, who set the standard, and then the difference from the standard is what allows you to call something dense, as in using a lack of means to say that something more is outside of its bounds due to not catering to the norm. I find that very, very ugly, and I would much prefer to talk with people because you can at least see on their faces how the things are saturating that you say. And in that sense, even if they don't want to talk to you, you have a sense of what it's about without having to have, invaded any further or gone into, false labeling. Yeah, because it's essentially the overdetermination that harms. The underdetermination can also harm by setting a false precedent when it means to exclude more complete information and its representative status as being more complete. In that sense, a lot of Anglo America is very much conflicted with a very emotionally primitive level of morality that is like Gen Z saying, and what's it to me? That's difficult. I don't have to deal with it. You're a schizophrenic. Don't write so dense. They make moral prescriptions in a very apoplectic way that is entitled and affected and expects to be taken seriously in its social ideas of reference as, the supported morality. And I think that it's effectively a slave morality insofar as it's a socialism of less, punishing more merely for having more than is the norm. So it's a tall poppy syndrome as well. Yeah, but now I spend a lot of minutes on this and it's kind of far from where we started, but still, I mean these things and I think that there's value in having these conversations or at least these monologues about things and sharing them and having thoughts about it. Yeah, what can I say? I schluck my brain like this, what I just done, that sound. It's like the soft inner tissues of my sinuses and cranium have, in some sense, become pretzeled, and I spatially need to rearrange them because there's air and fluid and tension in unfortunate ways that build up and is connected to breathing and, the emotional allostatic load in some sense, and that these things impact my real time ability to feel and get things done by being literal impediments to blood flow and to the availability of experience from local tissues, and that this is extended with electromagnetism in the things around me and in how I look, and all these, everything is non dual in a holographic way that is causally co commuting as information that is affected with, a common scheme of happening. And yeah, in that sense, I don't know, it's very weird to think about the extended aspects of self and how they affect others. Like, of course, I have a certain energy and it changed throughout this video, and that says something structurally about the ontology of me as meat as well. Your sense of from the manifest image of personhood and man in the world, what is emotionally and psychologically profilable in those terms as the content of my emersism, so to say. But yeah, no, I think that particle physics and quality are going to have a non dual relationship in less than 30 years, and that some aspects of this are already integrated in private AI models that we do not currently have access to. But I do think that there's a lot of it as well in open source models, and that the the descriptions that make these things available are going to be developed, and that there's going to be an irrigation of the literal, structural, chemical, electro, scientific and social descriptions. There's going to be a grand unification of description into, a base of tradable ontology that is, like electrical engineering, considered just a given. You don't have to qualify what makes the transistor ontologically available to be called the transistor, because those effects at large are available. Just like that, structuralism won insofar as AI is real and language is, you know, like the Gavagai problem from Coin with how do you stabilize what reference means when someone points to a rabbit and the guy says, is it, this is Gavagai. He says the word Gavagai, and you ask, is it rabbithood? Is it rabbiting? Doth rabbithood abound there in a particular manner? What is the sense situancy? And I would say that, for image generators that work with prompts, the essential effect is of being able to call in words for the equivalent in a qualitative experience. And so, images is something that you see. It has a qualitative component. It's not secondarily representational in the way that language is without a literal resemblance. The literal abilities to mean are entailed in the literal resemblances when a picture is generated with adequacy for the description as prompt, which enabled it to be, taken in by a machine and made more of. This ability to make more of is already latently indexed by the body, as well by, the aspects of AI that have interdisciplinary knowledge in excess of the training data's descriptions. That is the part of concepts that bleed together and blend and can be useful with, in ways that an individual expert isn't useful for not having individuated with that broad spectrum of basic givens. We can say it like that. Yeah, I think you get the drift of what I'm saying with all this stuff. It's that realism has meaning, that design is a part of ontology, that is, consciousness definitely happens, and insofar as it happens, it has to be fundamental, since, how could we say, nothing stops being just because it's dependent on something. Just because it's dependent on the body doesn't mean that experience isn't what I'm having. It remains ontologically there, even though if I stop breathing, it would effectively change in nature completely in a way that's very similar to deep sleep. So, yeah, I don't know. But we need to keep having these schema expansions so that the future can be richer than, the forms of socialized common irony and repression that we have had in terms of both Christian hegemony and its secular Puritan cathedral alternative in public life known as leftism at large. I would also just preface this by saying that I am gay, and that does imply in some sense that I require some people with traditional views to abstain from violence against me when I engage in things that I like doing, that I find natural, that they don't find natural. And that this kind of, how could we say, diplomacy is to be had in public, but in your own home, you can think of me what you want, as I will do with you. And that saying these things on social media doesn't have to come to job loss or ostracism in a moral capacity, where we have these agreed upon gray zones where trade is facilitated and interpersonal norms apply insofar as getting things done requires it, as an ethics rather than a morality. The difference being that ethics relate to the pragmatic factor and morality relates to how you really in your soul feel about what is right and wrong. Yeah. I, of course, am an error theorist in terms of saying that given that there are different moralities, it's not true to say that something is wrong. It's rather that you feel really bad about it and you would really like that something else happens, but given that this has happened, you demand reparations, but that this is not necessarily necessary given that some criminals really do get away with it, and that therefore the saying that it really is wrong or that it really is not wrong is in some sense a misplaced sentiment that tries to overreach who that can be descriptive for and in what terms. And so, I would say that What we do ethically is a protocol that makes life livable, but if you are a bad person, it's not necessarily an ethical judgment. And morality as such, in some sense, doesn't, it's like free will. The word is there, these concepts are there, you can behave that way, but what it means to God, in some sense, is not ours to decide. And so I would rather, in some sense, wait and see, or develop something richer than morality is, in terms first of ethics and then in terms of how we are co-affected and how that settles. Yeah. Well, thank you. This has now been a little while, and I'm very glad if you benefited from this, made it this far. I hope to be fluid like this again. It's like, an engine. You have to get well going, otherwise it's going to be a rough ride at the start. Oh, yeah, have to warm up before you can just go on doing the athletic stuff. Thank you.